Welcome to our podcast for college Catholics, where we discuss faith and spirituality from a Catholic perspective. I am your host, Father Patrick Wainwright. The last couple of episodes, I spoke about what it means to have supernatural faith, that faith that is necessary for salvation, and about some of its characteristics. One of those characteristics is that our faith has to be all-encompassing. It should affect our entire manner of living, our thoughts, and our choices. And that is exactly what happened in the life of a young man who died at 24 years of age in Italy. His name is Pier Giorgio Frassati. So today I invite a guest, Matthew Zahn, to explain and speak about his life, virtues and interior life. Matthew was born and raised near Los Angeles, California, went to college at UCLA, majoring in psychology. After that, he dedicated 2 years of his life to be a focused missionary and was stationed at the University of Oregon. He then spent around 2 years in discernment at our House of Formation of Miles Christi here in Michigan, where we became good friends. He is now resuming his dedication to being a missionary with focus. Hi, Matthew. How are you doing?
Great, Father Patrick. Thank you very much for having me on today.
Great to have you here. And we have here a picture, like a framed picture of Pier Giorgio Frassati here for those who, of course, this is an audio-only podcast, so you don't see what we have here in the studio. But it was brought by Matthew to have here, and so that he intercedes for us. So how did you become acquainted with Pier Giorgio, and how did you start to have a devotion to him?
Absolutely. Yeah, actually, the icon that I have here was given to me by the same person that really gave me the biggest introduction to Pier Giorgio, and that was my Aunt Anne, actually. So shout out to her. I think before...
Thank you, Anne,
thank
for
you,
doing
Auntie
this.
Anne. No, before... Even then, I think he's pretty trendy these days, right? Blessed Pier Giorgio, along with others like Max Colby and
right.
Therese of Lisieux. So I heard about him when my aunt, for one of my birthdays, gave me a book called A Man of the Beatitudes. And this is one of the biographies of Blessed Pier Giorgio. It's written by his sister, Luciana Frassati. So after that, she eventually gave me this icon, really just 2 years ago now, and I've had it with me. So that's
Wonderful.
when my first introduction to the man, Blessed Pier Giorgio.
Wonderful. And why don't you tell us a little bit about his life, sort of a biography, so that we all are listeners and, we can all learn a bit more about Pier Giorgio.
Absolutely, yes. So he was born April 6th, 1901 in Turin, Italy. And he was born into a wealthy family by today's standards and certainly then as well. His father was in the government. He was an Italian senator. And at some point during World War I, he became the Italian ambassador to Germany. Also, he was the owner of a periodical, a newspaper, La Stampa. And
right.
So you've heard of that.
Yeah, it's like owning the USA Today or New York Times, something like that.
Exactly.
Or the Washington Post.
Right, right.
So pretty big dude there.
Yeah, so his family had a lot of means, certainly, growing up. And
the dad was atheist, right?
Yes, I think both of his parents, they certainly... They weren't much of a support to him in his faith growing up. So, there are different accounts. But, so his father may have well, in fact, been atheist. But
or agnostic. That's what I think. I think he was agnostic, and his mom was Catholic, but not very practicing. Something like that.
Yeah, because it was very cultural, I'm sure, at that time, especially in Italy. So, and Pier Giorgio was one that from a very young age displayed a lot of piety. So there are stories in some of the accounts, some of the biographies that explain when he was 3 or 4 years old, just having a supernatural kind of attentiveness. First of all, just to the poor, especially. So where they were at, they would get beggars that would come by and knock on their door and ask for alms, and he would be really upset if any of his family ever turned someone away.
Of course.
So there was already a heart that burned for others, and especially for the poor when he was very young. And there's other stories about the family being at Mass on Sundays, and there would be a racket or a noise that would come from the back of the church, and everybody would turn around. But little Pier Giorgio, 4 or 5 year old Pier Giorgio, is laser focused.
Good for him.
Up at the front. So it's just things that are uncommon, unnatural. So from a very young age, he kind of manifested, religiosity at the very least. So things that maybe aren't typical for kids that age. And then so he began his education. Of course, his family had great means, so he and his sister kind of had private tutors. They were brought up in very well educated as well. But he started to slip behind, and this became very clear By the time he was around 12 years old, he was really struggling, particularly with Latin. So at some point, he was almost held back. He was transferred to a school where he could get a little more special attention.
Right, and also Latin, I guess, in that time was commonplace in basic education. Also, he was part of the elite of society, I think, because if his dad was an ambassador to Germany and owner of a periodical, of course, I mean,
absolutely,
they were an important family in the society.
Right. So he began to be educated with the Jesuits when he was 12 years old.
So that was the fallback.
Right. It was embarrassing. I mean, he talks about this in letters. It was an embarrassment to have to be sent away. So not keeping track with his sister and other people that they were going to school with. So interestingly enough, this is, and you can see this is how God tends to work. So much good and so much fruit came from this thing that, he probably accepted in humility.
Right. Well, how we say God writes straight with crooked lines.
Yes. And
sometimes what we think might be bad for us or an embarrassment, it's a means for God to bring you closer to whom you should be.
Absolutely. I wonder at the time, I know there were letters back and forth because they sent him away. So he writes letters back and forth to his parents describing this. And so I'm sure that they go more detail about his spiritual state and everything that was going on when that happened. But so
there's a book with all the letters of Pier Giorgio. So if anyone is interested in reading more, I'll put it in the description, the name of the book, Letters of Pier Giorgio Frassati, something like that.
Great. Yeah, it's awesome that we have those things. So it was with the Jesuits that many people agree this began his great devotion to the Eucharist. So it was something that one of his educators there, who was a priest, petitioned to allow him to receive communion on a daily basis, which is something at the time was not very common. Pope St. Pius X was, he was
encouraging it.
Exactly.
Right. So because what happens is that and it's okay. There are different moments in the church history where some things are practices, and one of those practices was that people received communion once a week, and that was a normal practice for a devout person, right? So Pope Pius X and other saints, even St. Ignatius of Loyola, and that's why the Jesuits connection there, it has a lot to do. St. Ignatius had encouraged in the past frequent communion, and there you have Pier Giorgio asking for daily communion, and that was like a very unique thing, if you want, that some people could be granted the permission, right?
Right, and so there are a lot of stories. This was the beginning, but he would live. He had lived half of his life at that point. He would live 12 more years. So for 12 more years, a daily communicant, and in a lot of the stories about his life, he would go to great lengths to make sure that he received communion, especially if he was going on trips, especially some of the hikes that he has become very famous for. He would make sure that he was getting to Mass at very, very early in the morning before setting out on some of these hikes. So his devotion to the Eucharist specifically is something that personally, but he also made it part of his apostolate as well.
Right, and there you see how he did not go to Mass when he had nothing else to do, and he had in downtime he would go to Mass. He would make a special effort to find time to go to Mass, even if he had to wake up earlier, before time to go to school or before going on a hike, and he would make sure he went to Mass at a more sacrificial moment, if you want, right? To be able to go to Mass.
Yes, exactly. So this became one of his devotions, one of the practices,
right? A pillar of his spiritual life.
Absolutely, absolutely. And he came into contact with the Salesians, which were St. John Bosco was preceded him exactly. I mean, only decades before, right? In the middle or the end of the 19th century.
The end of the 1800s, toward the end.
Yeah,
correct.
So in the same area, and the Salesians actually, his father had connections with the Salesians, and he received some schooling from them as well. And it was there that he began his devotion as well to weekly, if not more frequently, confession. So he had that was also part of his one of his practices. And I think what's important to note, we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the things that he did, is that it was not a checklist that he was creating. There was no mechanical aspect to these things. That these represented for him his love and devotion to God, and these are his expressions of that love. It was never Pier Giorgio was never the type of guy that's like, okay, let me do all these things, and now I know that I'm loving God. It was these sprang from the love that he had for God and his desire to love Him and to be intimate with Him. So,
right. Very good. Very good.
And yeah, he also came in contact. This is a little bit later with the Vincentians. So and the Saint Vincent de Paul Society. When he was 16, they would have conferences, and he's also very well known for his work with the poor. And I had mentioned a little bit from a very young age, he had already displayed kind of a heart for the poor. So he was involved with Saint Vincent de Paul, and then eventually even with the Dominicans. So he kind of it was a mixed bag, different spiritualities, but you see them all represented in his life. And with the Dominicans, of course, that's where he really his devotion to Our Lady, particularly through the Rosary, began to take root. So he was carrying the Rosary around all the time. People would ask him, what is this that you're carrying with you? And he would say, referring to the Rosary, he said, I carry my will in my pocket, my will and testament.
Like my testament.
Exactly.
Right. So all this happened throughout his entire life, through high school and college education, if you want. Now, he went with the Jesuits to finish basically his high school.
Mm-hmm.
And then he started studying engineering, and he made a change there. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely, yeah. So he started studying, it was at the Royal Academy, Pontifical Academy in Turin, and he was a mining engineer. That's what he was studying for. So, what's incredible about Frassati is that, and what's important, I think, for as college students to understand, he always knew the why behind what he was doing. He was very much motivated by a desire to bring Christ to others through everything that he was doing. So, he even says that his motivation for becoming a mining engineer was to serve Christ better among the miners. And as a result of this, the way that he looked at his studies was very much from a supernatural perspective. So his desire for a fruitful apostolate amongst the miners is what encouraged him, or you might say buoyed him up amidst the very arduous studies that were involved in engineering. So
now, one question, because I think you referred to this one off the air when we were talking before. So he at one point had to discern his vocation, right? So generally speaking, in the spiritual life, maybe around when you're 19, 20, 21, you want to discern what God is asking of you.
Right.
And he discerned something about the priesthood, and then he decided to stay in Italy. How was that?
Right. Yes. So I think for a lot of young men that are going to daily mass or displaying some kind of devotion outside, extraordinary, or outside of what's ordinary, a lot of people think, oh man, maybe this guy's going to be a priest. And in fact, this is something that had crossed his mind, and certainly he had prayed about a lot. But like I mentioned, his father was the Italian ambassador to Germany. So when they were in Germany, he continued his work among the poor like he was doing when he was in Italy. And it was there that things socially were a little different. So the priests in Germany were closer to the people. Somehow in Italy, and you might have a better idea of this, there was a little more distance between, priests weren't necessarily seen in the streets working among the poorest of the poor. He saw it in Germany, but he realized he's not going to be in Germany forever. He was called to be in Italy. That's where he was from. So he said, if the situation in Italy was like it is in Germany, he would want to be a priest. But he realized his vocation primarily was to work in and among the poor, and he couldn't do that as a priest. So it's interesting. He understood that was primary. But then on top of that, and we discussed this as well, but he also at some point when he was in college fell in love. So there was a woman that he fell in love with. This is well recorded between letters that he sent to his sister talking about this. He kept it under wraps for a long time.
Right. The girl I heard the girl never knew.
Never knew. Which is wild.
He had this affection for her.
Right. And the reason part of this is because some of the biographies don't explain exactly, but I'm assuming maybe her family was from a different social sphere.
Right. That happened. Yeah. The same thing with the priests. There may social things. There are social circumstances that condition our particular vocation.
Right.
That's how it is throughout history.
So he knew his parents didn't approve of this girl when there had been mention, and he knew that would be the case, and out of obedience to them, never engaged in any kind of relationship, never pursued her in any way.
Her.
So
correct.
Kind of wild. Yeah, I mean, he was very difficult, I'm sure, in that.
Right.
I think he had some premonition that he wasn't going to live
Right.
very
That's,
long.
I think you were talking about that before, that he perceived somehow spiritually that he had to be more dedicated to his apostolate and that his life was going to be short in some way. So he probably, that premonition kept him from, let's say, pursuing this girl completely.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's the important thing, again, is that everything, because it can be easy in college to be selfish in an excessive way. You need to be concerned about yourself and getting your studies done and doing well. It's very easy to slip into something not necessarily sinful, but being self-absorbed. That's kind of what happens in college.
And I think that's another characteristic of his life, that he was completely the opposite, right? He was never self-absorbed, not self-centered, not selfish. On the contrary, he was always willing to serve others in any way and shape or form that he could. Right?
Yeah. So even in his studies, I mean, that question was always before him. What am I doing this for? What is the purpose of this? And for him, it was for his own sanctification and the sanctification of others. That was beyond question.
Right. And that's another very good point that you made just there. When I talk to college students and high school students that are thinking about going to college, right? How important it is to tell them very clearly, whatever you're going to study, ask yourself, what is it that God wants of you? This that you're going to study, what are you going to study it for? And that's where the answer to that question helps discern, am I doing the right decision? If I'm studying only to be famous or to be successful, where is the glory of God involved in this? Where's the benefit of my neighbor? How am I going to bring Christ to others with my studies? And Pier Giorgio gives us a very good example in that sense, that he wanted to study mining engineering because he wanted to be with the miners, working with them and evangelizing them in some way, as with the ability of being an engineer and having that capacity.
And it would talk about, he was very serious about his studies as well. So there were times his family had a vacation home up in Polon. I don't know if that's how it's pronounced, but northwest of where they were living, a summer house. And a lot of his friends would go there during the summer. And actually the final summer before he would end up dying, he stayed back in Turin where it was really hot and humid, uncomfortable, while all his friends were off vacationing, so that he could, hunker down and study. And also he was able to remain behind and care for the poor.
Right. And I think they asked him, why don't you come out? And he said, well, if everybody goes on vacation, who's going to take care of the poor?
Absolutely.
Right. So he wanted to stay and do that.
So
good for him.
And what he would do as well, sometimes, he's reading these dense engineering and science books, and he would often talk about breaking it up with spiritual reading scripture, and also reading other things, recreational reading. Like he would read Dante. He loved Dante. So that's another little thing that he did to get through it, with the goal in mind.
So let's continue with his biography, right? So he finished high school, he started college. What next? What happened next, and how is it that he came to die?
Right. Yeah. So he ended up dying just before completing his degree. So he hadn't even quite completed a degree. You can imagine a program. It was maybe a master's program or something. So he was 24 years old. 4 to 5 years. Exactly. So he hadn't quite completed it. And then actually he was gearing up to enter the military, because it was compulsory up until the 90s at some point for all Italian men to enter the military at some point. So he was actually gearing up for that. He would have done that right after, but then he ended up dying in 1925 at the age of 24. So I guess some other things that are to talk about. He was very involved in a lot of different organizations over the course of his time in college. Political
organizations that he was involved for his faith, right?
Right.
Primarily.
Yes, absolutely. One of them was called the Balbo Circle. There were others as well, like kind of like Catholic Action within Italy, right? So I mean, because you can imagine, it's World War I. We're talking about the advent of fascism and things like that, where and his father was also a politician, so he was fighting for the faith in the public square, sphere. Yes. So, and I think with all of this, it can be easy to think, man, he lived through World War I. He was seeing some really difficult times, and certainly he was. How in the world was this guy so joyful? Joy was one of the characteristics that a lot of people know him for, and I think that is something that is so needed now here and today in the world. It's something that, being an apostle of joy.
Absolutely.
Because a lot of times, and this is my tendency as well. When I heard about Pier Giorgio, I thought, oh, joy, how is he so joyful? And you think, oh, well, he was a saint, so of course, I mean, that's just how it was. But really, I mean, if you look at his life, and we've mentioned a little bit of already, there was a lot of suffering. There was a lot of suffering.
Right.
Not only, we mentioned at the beginning, there was this disconnect between his parents and himself that, they weren't believing, they weren't practicing. They thought he was crazy, and he would come home and all these things he was doing. I mean, there are a lot of different examples of it, but he would come home without shoes or without a jacket because he had spent all day among the poor, and he would be giving away literally his clothes.
Right. I heard of another example that maybe his parents would also be very upset about this, right? When he had to travel, he would travel by train, which to begin with, I guess that would have been also somewhat of a practice of poverty for an elite society person, right? But not only that, he would also travel in third class, where first class, second class, third class. And some of his friends would ask him, why do you travel in third class, And he would say, well, because there is no fourth class. Not I would have traveled in fourth class,
Right.
So that's pretty impressive because that's a way of practicing spiritual poverty, right? So many times, even when we speak about the gospel and blessed are the poor in spirit, people ask, well, what does spiritual poverty mean? Does it mean that I have to give away everything that I have or not? And properly speaking, it's not necessarily what you possess, but how you use it and how is your heart attached to it or not, right? So in this case, we see an example, as many other saints who were wealthy in a social way, wealthy, they had money, but they were not greedy, and they used it to the best of their ability for the benefit of others, and they were themselves living detached and poorly, right? So in this case, he could have traveled in a better quality car, let's say, and he would instead travel in third class just to practice poverty. And that's a great example because it's not just about talking about the poor. He also lived out his virtue of poverty, spiritual poverty.
Right. I think there's a story. I think it was his 21st birthday. His father said it was going to give him a brand new car. So exactly what you're saying. I'll give you a car or the equivalent.
This is 1920.
Yeah. So
1930.
come on, they didn't have cars back
right?
then, really. So only the wealthiest could. And so I said, I'll give you a car or the equivalent in money, in the cash value. I said, I'll take the money. And so he got the money and immediately gave it away to the poor. I mean, so all of it, everything that he used it in a few different ways.
That's pretty amazing.
Explain. So that kind of, and some of his friends would say, Pier Giorgio would talk about all these high values and living in a Christian society, and they said, well, easy for you to say. You come from a rich family, you have all these means, and he said, I would renounce my inheritance, without questioning it.
Wow, good for him.
Yeah, he put his money where his mouth is, certainly, and that's eventually as well how he ended up dying because of his apostolate with the poor.
So why don't you tell us how it is that he died, why he died, and so forth?
Right.
And what happened after his death? Because that's also important,
Absolutely.
Right? His funeral.
Absolutely. So, like we said, we haven't detailed it in its entirety. I mean, it's incredible the amount of time that he spent with the poor, and we're talking not only with maybe homeless people on the street, but he was going and he was visiting houses where there were lepers and people that were very seriously ill. And, it was through this kind of work that he eventually contracted poliomyelitis, and which at the time, this is before there were any vaccines or anything like that. And the way that it details it in one of the accounts that I read, there's an incubation period, of course, and then as soon as he started experiencing symptoms, within 5 days, he was dead.
Oh my!
And for those that don't know, I mean, polio, you have fever, flu-like symptoms, but it also it's muscle paralysis, and so it leaves you paralyzed. So eventually, and he was up until the last minutes, he was doing everything that he could, and until when he wasn't able to move, even he was scrawling notes, kind of and scribbling on paper to make sure that this person is taken cared for. Or this family receives this donation, or
wow, incredible.
And then so you eventually, and what happens eventually is that your lungs, your breathing apparatus is paralyzed. So within 5 days, it was a long and painful death that he experienced.
Wow, and so then he passed away,
right?
And the funeral came, and what happened?
Yeah, that was one of the first stories I remember hearing about him. Is that he has there's this funeral procession, and this entire time, his parents were aware of him being out and about and doing some odd things, but they had no idea the extent to which he was working with the poor. And, they eventually found out that's how he died. But this funeral procession is going through the streets of Turin, and thousands upon thousands of homeless and poor and sick people are join the procession. And this is really what opened his family's eyes to what really had been going on.
Right, and probably also to the church to realize, okay, this man is a saint, right?
Right.
So good. So then, all right, so then devotion to him begins, right? And then we have, I would like to share the intercession of the saints, right? So when the saints are in heaven, we can pray to them through their intercession so that we may obtain graces from God. And these graces are given by God. The saints are human beings like we are, but because their souls are in heaven in the presence of God, they have an intercessory power. And in the case of at that time, Pier Giorgio, people were praying to him as we do in the Catholic tradition. And there was a very impressive cure. And I'm going to relate that so that we can also have him as an intercessor. So there are many miracles that were recognized by many people and witnessed by many people, but the church has to officially recognize one so that he may become or be declared blessed, right? And then there should be another miracle which is not yet confirmed or approved to become a saint, right? To be called a saint. So the one that the church officially recognized was the healing of Domenico Celan in 1933. At the time, Domenico was 40 years old, and he was suffering from a tubercular disease of the spine, paralyzed, and he was near death. So a priest visited him on December 28th, 1933, and brought a small prayer card of Saint Pier Giorgio. He was not blessed at the time, and but the cause of canonization was already in process. So the priest knew, Pier Giorgio needs a miracle approved, so let's pray to him. So when they did this, they prayed to Pier Giorgio, thanks to this priest's suggestion, and Domenico was miraculously cured and actually lived 35 more years.
Wow.
So this was impressive, and finally that miracle was approved, let's say, in 1989, and Blessed John Paul Saint John Paul II beatified him on May 20th, 1990. And here we come to one important thing that we forgot to say at the beginning. You, Matthew, and I have something in common.
That's right.
That is really close to Pier Giorgio. And that's that we're born on July 9th, the same day. Right. It's incredible.
Yes, and so the 4th of July is the day that Pier Giorgio died, which is that is kind of commemorated as his feast. He's not a saint yet, but that's the day. So
whenever we remember the 4th of July, we also remember Pier Giorgio.
Right.
So anyone hearing, remember 4th of July, Pier Giorgio Frassati.
That's right. We're within the octave, so that's good.
Very good, very good. So,
and I guess another thing that's kind of interesting related
to that. Any other things that you?
Yeah, I mean, just the fact also too, even with the man that was healed, Domenico, he was suffering from a disease that was very similar to what Pier Giorgio died from. I don't know. I know there's other stories like that with other saints.
Right.
It's interesting that.
Right, and there's another one that I saw recently, and I'm going to put the link to this YouTube video on the show notes. So anyone listening, check the show notes, and there I will put the link to the books that we're talking about, and also I'll put a prayer we're going to say at the end. And this, it's okay. It's pretty miraculous. I wouldn't call it a miracle yet because it hasn't been approved by the church. But it's a YouTube video of a family sharing the story of their son. Their son, and around 2015, went off to college, and he was working in the roof of his recently rented dorm room, which was a house, right?
Mm.
But like a family house, and he fell, and he was knocked unconscious.
Oh, wow.
Unconscious. So somebody found him. They called the family, and they were really concerned. The brothers were concerned. The parents were concerned.
Mm.
They took them to the hospital, and his situation was close to death, right? So he had injured his brain. His brain had shifted like about an inch or something like that. It was swelling, and they were trying to keep the swelling down, but it was not possible. They had to put him into an induced coma, and he was unresponsive. So I'm gonna tease it a little bit. Hopefully, you all can check the video. But in that time, the mother heard about Pier Giorgio Frassati. Someone sent her a picture similar to the one, but it's a picture. So from Pier Giorgio. And she started praying to him and told everybody else to pray to Pier Giorgio, blessed Pier Giorgio. And then his son, this young man called Kevin Becker, started to recover. First, he moved a little hand, and then a little bit more, and then finally he got it to complete recovery. So the doctors were amazed at his cure, right? And then he said, once he was able to talk, that he had a dream as he was in coma, that he was in his room, in that dorm room at college, and a buddy seemed to come in, and he didn't recognize him. He said, "Who are you?" "Oh, I'm your roommate." "I don't... Roommate?" Yeah, and you need to stay here, because he was about to leave the house, and this guy told him, no, you need to stay here. You need to stay here. Okay, so he stayed here. And then he started to recover and woke up. And then the mother said, "And who was he?" "I don't know." And then the mother showed him the picture of Blessed Pier Giorgio. And Kevin said, "That's the guy. That's the guy I saw in my dream." Right? So pretty impressive. So anyway, so that's another impressive miracle, if you want, or story that hopefully it's approved as a miracle. It has to go through all the Vatican approvals, right? But maybe it's one of those many that are... One of them has to be chosen to be for his canonization. All right. Any other anecdote that you have, or any other way that it has impacted your life?
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I could just say, he has a lot. He's very quotable as well. He wrote a lot of letters. He gave even speeches to some of these organizations and groups that we had referenced. And I think one of the things that has struck me the most, it's a quote where he starts. I don't remember it perfectly, but he says something like, "We who by the grace of God are Catholics must not squander the best years of our lives living for things which don't, in fact, bring any true happiness." You hear echoes of this sometimes in Pope St. John Paul II when he's talking at World Youth Days. But it's this principle, this fact, this beautiful kind of awestruck thing, and this is why I think so many people look at someone like Blessed Pier Giorgio Frassati, is because he gave God everything. And not only that, but he gave him the best years of his life, his youth. Right. I think this is something that is awe-inspiring, and people, we look, and I certainly look at him, and I want to do the same. I want to give God everything and hold nothing back. So
absolutely, and also it's typical temptation of the world to say, no, give your best years of the youth to worldliness, right? To sin, to partying, to having fun, to making money, to spending it, and so forth. To do all these crazy things. And many are attracted by that because maybe later in life I cannot do it. So maybe then I have to form a family, and I won't be able to be free like I'm now. So instead, Pier Giorgio gives you the opposite. No, if these are the best years of your life, dedicate them to the glory of God, right? To save your neighbor, to help your neighbor. That's awesome. So, well, very good. Well, I encourage you. So we're gonna start getting here to the end of our episode. So I encourage you all to, first of all, pray to Blessed Pier Giorgio Frassati to help you become saints, and also for his intercession. There's a prayer we're going to say. I'm going to read it right now, so everybody gets a chance to read it, to pray it together with us. And I'm going to put it in the show notes so you can find it. It's a prayer approved for use, and maybe you can get a miracle done by his intercession. So the prayer goes like this, and we'll say it all together spiritually. I'm going to say it out loud. O merciful God, who through the perils of the world deigned to preserve by your grace your servant Pier Giorgio Frassati, pure of heart and ardent of charity, listen, we ask you, to our prayers, and if it is in your designs that he be glorified by the Church, show us your will, granting us the graces we ask of you through his intercession, by the merits of Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
So that's the first thing I encourage you all to do, to pray to Pier Giorgio to help you become better people, become saints and virtuous, and also to help you reach out to others. And the second one is to try to imitate him in some of his virtues. Particularly, what I would recommend is his fervent love for the Holy Eucharist and his desire to bring others to Christ through his apostolate, right? So we can do those two things, to go more frequently to the Eucharist, to Jesus and the Eucharist, and to try to bring others to the faith through through apostolate, right? So he dedicated many hours to all-night adoration, right?
Oh, all the time. Yeah, starting from a very young age, he was doing. He went up to a seminary or a group of priests that, I don't know if it was a monastery or something, and he said, "Hey, fathers, can I join you?" And they're like, "Oh, I don't think you're ready for this." He's like, "No, I've been doing this since I was young." So he would pray nocturnal adoration all the time, all night.
That's awesome. Okay, very good. Well, Matthew, thank you very, very much for all this wisdom that you shared with us. And that will be all for today. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. As we just shared, while his interior life was of the greatest importance in his life, Blessed Pier Giorgio also had a clear commitment to doing apostolate, sharing his faith. So you can do something similar as well to bring the gospel to those around you. So make sure you share this episode with your friends so they too can learn about the saints, particularly Pier Giorgio, and their exemplary intercession. Besides, remember to subscribe to this show through Apple or Google or Spotify to receive all the future episodes. And if you like this episode, please consider writing a positive review or rating it on Apple Podcasts. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next time. May God bless your day.